Hello, good evening, children of the night, and welcome to the finale of Spooky Game Season on Urban Planning. It's Halloween. Dark things roam abroad. So tonight I'm bringing you an evening of scary stories, darkness, and fear.
But I'm not going to do that for the whole time, because I think it gets pretty tedious pretty quickly, and we can probably do without the there we go, that's a lot better. It's all a bit childish. No, so tonight I'm going to be bringing you some ghost stories, some classic ghost stories from some of the some well-known horror authors, and some authors who you wouldn't necessarily associate with horror but have written some classic stories in their time. And I'm going to be sipping out of this spooky straw. Let's face it, this makeup is going to be everywhere by the end of this, but for the moment, it's not. So I'm starting out with a story that's kind of become, well, I guess Cthulhu is what's become overused. You can get Cthulhu plushes now. The whole thing has just got completely out of hand, and there's people probably in the world who don't even know that H.P. Lovecraft was the originator of Cthulhu and the Cthulhu mythos. Something that's become, just so overused in games and media in general, but does originate with classic horror stories. I'm reading from Penguin Modern Classics H.P. Lovecraft, which is a very good book if you're interested. It goes without saying that H.P. Lovecraft was an odd man, quite a racist, and quite unpleasant in his descriptions in his books of certain races, despite being obsessed with Arabian Nights as a child and Arabian culture in general, giving himself the pseudonym Abdul Abzib, or whatever it was, who he attributed to the writing of the Necronomicon in his books in his later work. So we are going to read Call of Cthulhu, which is where the Cthulhu mythos originates. So we'll see how we do. Unlike some of the other videos I've done, this is all live. I am going to trip over words. I am going to mess up. I'm sorry. That's just going to have to be part of it. I will try and continue as though I haven't monstrously screwed up, even when I do, just for the sake of this not becoming unbearable. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you H.P. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu. Found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great powers or beings there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps, in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity. Forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. 1. The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle, wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood, if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came a single glimpse of forbidding aeons which chills me when I think of it, and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 27, with the death of my grand-uncle George Gamble Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angle was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside, which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my great-uncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will later be published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor always carried in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did, seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle, in his latter years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle less than an inch thick, and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of Cubism and Futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind the bulk of these designs seemed certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarities with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even to hint at its remotest affiliations. Among these apparent hieroglyphs was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted by a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. But it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings, in Professor Angle's most recent hand, and made no pretence to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of the word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, at 1908 AAS MTG, Notes on Same, and Professor Webb's Act. The other manuscript's papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. And the rest sorry, I stumbled on that one. and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological sourcebooks as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Eastern Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March the 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angle, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognised him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at Rhode Island School of Design, and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Wilcox was a precocious youth of no genius but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility, and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of the host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner, which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and my uncle showed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablets implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a frantically poetic cast, which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I've since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or the garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy would transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Futagan. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angle. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness, and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his nightclothes, when waking had stolen bewilderingly onto him. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognising both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angle became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview the manuscript recalls daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery, whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in enigmatic sense impact undescribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Relier. On March the 23rd, the manuscript continued, Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, who he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he'd formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words as repeated by Dr. Toby convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than a mental disorder. On April the 2nd, at about 3 p.m, every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat up bright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Angle he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought. So much, in fact, that only the ingrained scepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox has had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must at the very least have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. This original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and businesses, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there. Always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case there is a mention of a dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he'd latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from aesthetes told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, and the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic, nameless thing visible toward the last. One case which the note describes with emphasis was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings towards theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure, and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation. But as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out in the notes in full. I've often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angle must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leapt from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfilment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest towards the end of March. Voodoo's orgy multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumour and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Edouard Bonneau hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings, all told, and I can at this date scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside, but I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of an older matter mentioned by the professor. Part 2. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and bas-relief so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angle had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphs, and heard the ominous syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this in so stirring and horrible a connection that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angle, as benefited one of his authority and attainments, had had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and, in a short time, the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had travelled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette, whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans, during a raid on supposed voodoo meetings, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that police could not realise that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered, hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure, whose utter strangeness, an air of genuinely abysmal antiquity, hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognised school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplacable stone. figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline with an octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestals covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block. The seat occupied the centre, while the long curved claws of the doubled-up, crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more subtly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for the soapy greenish-black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of even the remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life, in which our world and conceptions have no part. And yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in the gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told, with some diffidence, of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimo whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Eskimo knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifice, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil, or Tornasuk, and of this Professor Webb had taken careful phonetic copy from an aged Angakok or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now, of prime significance was the fetish which the cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist Eskimo. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really awed silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to the two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What in substance both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very much like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrases chanted aloud. Funglui munglu naf Cthulhu rele waga nagal fatan. Legrasse had one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrations had told them the world's meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Relay Dead, Cthulhu waits dreaming. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legrasse related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attach profound significance. It savoured of the wildest dreams of myth-maker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination amongst such pariahs as might be expected to possess it. On November the 1st, 1907, there had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating, far within the black haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil frames, and, the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or a fragment of rotting wall, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every funguous islet combined to create. At length the squatters' settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance together another inch towards the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on, unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of hidden lake, unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white polypus thing with luminous eyes. The squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before D'Urberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was a nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men as they ploughed on through the black morass towards the red glare and muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men, and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whipped themselves to demonic heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gusts of hell. Now and then the less organised ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise in sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Funglui, Muglu Naf Cthulhu, Relier Wagar Nagel Fatan. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a Simon or an Anglo could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the centre of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds, set up at regular intervals with the flame-girt monolith as a centre, hung, head downwards, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right in endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unilluminated spot deeper within the wood of ancient legendary and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees, but I suppose he'd been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired and escapes were made, but in the end Legras was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on an improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legras. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very low and mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a colouring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Relier, under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Some day he would call, when the stars were ready and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of the earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant only meant this: in his house at Relier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders, and averred that the killing had been done by the black-winged ones which had come to them for their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been aeons when other things ruled on earth, and they had had great cities. Remains of them, he said, and the deathless Chinaman had told him were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had, indeed, come themselves from the stars, and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky, but when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Relier, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for glorious resurrection, when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tombs. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by moulding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshy minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great ones showed to them. Idols brought in dim areas from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and revelling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something had happened. The great stone city Relier, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves and deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, and cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and High Priest said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, mouldy and shadowy, full of dim rumours picked up in caverns beyond forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly. No amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the centre lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Irem, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult and virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, although the deathless Chinaman said there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Harazed, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially in the much-discussed couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die." Legras, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning the historic affiliations of the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said it was wholly secret. The authorities at Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legras's tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended, although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the Society. Caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Legras for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not so long ago. It is truly a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculptor I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise on hearing, after knowledge of what Legras has learnt of the cult, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image in the Greenland Devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by Eskimo Diabolists and mongrel Louisianans. Professor Angle's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though I privately suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by the professor were of course strong corroboration, but the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusions. So after thoroughly studying the manuscript again, and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes which the cult narrative of Legras, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculptor and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone above the Fleur-de-Lis building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture which flaunts its stuccoed front amid the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill, and under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded from the specimens scattered about that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard of as one of the great decadents, for his crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams, yet had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in this regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They and their subconscious residuum had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream bas-relief, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was no doubt the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall, he soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong, and hear with frightened expectancy the ceaseless, half-mental calling from underground, Cthulhu Ftgan, Cthulhu Ftgan. These words had formed part of that dread ritual which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Relaire, and I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amid the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the bas-relief, and in the terrible statue I now beheld, so that his imposture on my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was at a type at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably and wished him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into its origins and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legras and others of that old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, that was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure I was on the track of a very real, very secret and ancient religion, whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and the odd cuttings collected by Professor Angle. One thing I began to suspect, which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront after a careless push from a sailor. I did not forget the marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legrasse and his men, it is true, have been left alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncles after encountering the sculptor's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angle died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learnt much now. That's the end of part 2. We'll get to part 3 very shortly, but I need something to drink because my throat's getting sore. I muted you so you didn't have to hear the ice clinking. I'm nice like that. Wahaha. Part 3. The Madness from the Sea. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be total... It's a good start. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be a total effacing of the results of a mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain stray piece of shelf paper. It was nothing on which I would have naturally stumbled in the course of my daily round, for it was an old number of an Australian journal, the Sydney Bulletin, for April 18th, 1925. It had escaped even the Cutting Bureau, which had at the time of its issuance been avidly collecting material for my uncle's research. I had largely given over my inquiries into what Professor Angle called the Cthulhu cult, and was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum and a mineralogist of note. Examining one day the reserved specimens roughly set on the storage shelves in the rear room of the museum, my eye was caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers spread beneath the stones. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, for my friend has wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts, and the picture was a half-tone cut of a hideous stone image, almost identical with that Legrasse had found in the swamp. Eagerly clearing the sheet of its precious contents, I scanned the item in detail, and was disappointed to find it of only moderate length. What it suggested, however, was of more portentous significance to my flagging quest, and I carefully tore it out for immediate action. It read as follows: Mystery derelict found at sea. Vigilant arrives with helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. Rescued seaman refuses particulars of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. The Morrison Company's freighter Vigilant, bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning at its wharf in Darling Harbour, having in tow the battled and disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, New Zealand, which was sighted April 12th in south latitude 34 degrees 21 east, with one living and one dead man aboard. I mangled that latitude and longitude, I'm sorry. The Vigilant left Valparaiso March 25th, and on April 2nd was driven considerably south of her course by exceptionally heavy storms and monster waves. On April 12th, the derelict was sighted, and though apparently deserted, was found upon boarding to contain one survivor in a half-delirious condition, and one man who had evidently been dead for more than a week. The living man was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin, about a foot in height, regarding whose nature authorities at Sydney University, the Royal Society and the museum in College Street all profess complete bafflement, and which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht, in a small, carved shrine of common pattern. This man, after recovering his senses, told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustaf Johansson, a Norwegian of some intelligence, and had been second mate of the two-masted schooner Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Callao February 20th with a complement of 11 men. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown wildly south of her course by the great storm of March the 1st, and on March the 22nd, in south latitude 49 degrees 51, west longitude 128 degrees 34, encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakans and half-castes. Being ordered peremptorily to turn back, Captain Collins refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely and without warning upon the schooner with a peculiarly heavy battery of brass cannon forming part of the yacht's equipment. The Emma's men showed fight, says the survivor, and though the schooner began to sink from shots below the waterline, they managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her, grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck and being forced to kill them all, the number being slightly superior because of their particularly abhorrent and desperate though rather clumsy mode of fighting. 3 of the Emma's men, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green, were killed, and the remaining 8 under Second Mate Johansson proceeded to navigate the captured yacht, going ahead in their original direction to see if any reason for their ordering back had existed. The next day, it appears, they raised and landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore, though Johansson is queerly reticent about this part of the story, and speaks only of them falling into a rock chasm. Later, it seems, he and one companion boarded the yacht and tried to manage it, but were beaten about by the storm of April the 2nd. From that time till his rescue on the 12th, the man remembers little, and he does not even recall when William Bryden, his companion, died. Bryden's death reveals no apparent cause and was probably due to excitement or exposure. Cable advices from Dunedin report that the Alert was well known there as an island trader and bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. It was owned by a curious group whose frequent meetings and night trips to the woods attracted no little curiosity, and it had set sail in great haste just after the storm and earth tremors of March the 1st. Our Auckland correspondent gives the Emma and her crew an excellent reputation, and Johansson is described as a sober and worthy man. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter beginning tomorrow, at which every effort will be made to induce Johansson to speak more freely than he has done hitherto. This was all, together with the hellish image. This was all, together with the picture of the hellish image, but what a train of ideas it started in my mind. Here were new treasures of data on the Cthulhu cult and evidence that it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. What motive prompted the crew to order back the Emma as they sailed about with their hideous idol? What was the unknown island on which 6 of the Emma's crew had died, and about which the mate Johansson was so secretive? What had the Vice Admiralty's investigation brought out, and what was known of the noxious cult in Dunedin? And most marvellous of all, what deep and more than natural linkage of dates was this, which gave me a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turns of events so carefully noted by my uncle. March the 1st, our February 28th according to the international dateline, the earthquake and storm had come. From Dunedin, the Alert and her noisome crew had darted eagerly forth, as if imperiously summoned, and on the other side of the earth poets and artists had begun to dream of a strange, dank, cyclopean city, whilst the young sculptor had moulded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. March 23rd, the crew of the Emma had landed on an unknown island and left 6 men dead, and on that date the dreams of a sensitive man assumed a heightened vividness, and darkened with the dread of a giant monster's malign pursuit, whilst an architect had gone mad and a sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what of this storm on April the 2nd, the date on which all dreams of the dank city ceased, and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of strange fever? What of all this, and of those hints of old Castro about the sunken starborn old ones and their coming reign, their faithful cult and their mastery of dreams? Was I tottering on the brink of cosmic horrors beyond man's power to bear? If so, they must be horrors of the mind alone, for in some way the 2nd of April had put a stop to whatever monstrous menace had begun its siege of mankind's soul. That evening, after a day of hurried cabling and arranging, I bade my host adieu and took the train for San Francisco. In less than a month I was in Dunedin, where, however, I found that little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns. Waterfront scum was far too common for special mention, though there was vague talk about one inland trip these mongrels had made, during which faint drumming and red flame were noted on the distant hills. In Auckland I learned that Johansson had returned with yellow hair turned white after a perfunctory and inconclusive questioning at Sydney, and had thereafter sold his cottage in West Street and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of his stirring experience he would tell his friends no more than he had told the Admiralty officials, and all they could do was give me his Oslo address. After that I went to Sydney and talked profitlessly with seamen and members of the Vice Admiralty Court. I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use, at Circular Quay in Sydney Cove, but gained nothing from its non-committal bulk. The crouching image, with its cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings and hieroglyph pedestal, was preserved in the museum at Hyde Park, and I studied it long and well, finding it a thing of balefully exquisite workmanship, and with the same utter mystery, terrible antiquity and unearthly strangeness of material which I had noted in Legras's smaller specimen. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle, for they vowed the world had held no rock like it. Then I thought with a shudder of what Castro had told Legras about the primal great ones. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. Shaken with such a mental revelation as I had never before known, I now resolved to visit mate Johansson in Oslo. Sailing for London, I re-embarked at once for the Norwegian capital, and one autumn day landed at the trim wharves in the shadow of Egberg. Johansson's address, I discovered, lay in the old town of King Harald Hardrada, which kept alive the name of Oslo during all the centuries that the greater city masqueraded as Christiana. I made the brief trip by taxicab, and knocked with palpitant heart at the door of a neat and ancient building with plastered front. A sad-faced woman in black answered my summons, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustaf Johansson was no more. He had not survived his return, said his wife, for the doings at sea in 1925 had broken him. He had told her no more than he had told the public, but had left a long manuscript of technical matters, as he said, written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the peril of casual perusal. During a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. 2 Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. Physicians found no adequate cause for the end, and laid it to heart trouble and a weakened constitution. I now felt gnawing at my vitals that dark terror which will never leave me till I too am at rest. Accidentally or otherwise, persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscript, I bore the document away and began to read it on the London boat. It was a simple, rambling thing, a naive sailor's effort at a post-facto diary, and strove to recall day by day that last awful voyage. I cannot attempt to transcribe it verbatim in all its cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell its gist enough to show why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. Johansson, thank God, did not know quite all, even though he saw the city and the thing, but I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in time and space, and of all those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favoured by a nightmare cult, ready and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to sun and air. Johansson's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice Admiralty. The Emma, in ballast, had cleared Auckland on February 20th, and had felt the full force of that earthquake-born tempest which must have heaved up from the sea bottom the horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress when held up by the Alert on March 22nd, and I could feel the mate's regret as he wrote of her bombardment and sinking. Of the swarthy cult fiends on the Alert he speaks with significant horror. There was some peculiarly abominable quality about them, which made their destruction seem almost a duty, and Johansson shows ingenious wonder at the charge of ruthlessness brought against his party during the proceedings of the Court of Inquiry. Then, driven ahead by curiosity in their captured yacht under Johansson's command, the men sight a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea, and in south latitude 47 degrees, west longitude 126 degrees, come across a coastline of mingled mud, ooze and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of R'lyeh, that was built in measureless aeons beyond history by the vast, loathsome shapes that seeped down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in green slimy vaults and sending out at last, after cycles incalculable, the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive, and called imperiously to the faithful to come on a pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. All this Johansson did not suspect, but God knows he soon saw enough. I suppose that only a single mountain top, the hideous monolith-crowned citadel whereupon great Cthulhu was buried, actually emerged from the waters. When I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there, I almost wish to kill myself forthwith. Johansson and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of this dripping Babylon of elder demons, and must have guessed without guidance that it was nothing of this or any sane planet. Or at the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks, at the dizzying height of the great carven monolith, and at the stupefying identity of the colossal statues and bas-reliefs, with the queer image found in the shrine on the Alert, is poignantly visible in every line of the mate's frightened description. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansson achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city, for instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mention his talk about angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He had said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was an abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unlettered seaman felt the same thing whilst gazing on this terrible reality. Johansson and his men landed at a sloping mud bank on this monstrous acropolis, and clambered slipperily up over tight and oozy blocks which could have been no mortal staircase. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling out from this sea-soaked perversion, and twisted menace and suspense lurked leeringly in those crazily elusive angles of carven rock, where a second glance showed concavity after the first showed convexity. Something very like fright had come over all the explorers before anything was more definite than rock and ooze and weed was seen. Each would have fled as he not feared the scorn of the others, and it was only half-heartedly that they searched, vainly as it proved, for some portable souvenir to bear away. It was Rodriguez, the Portuguese, who climbed up the foot of the monolith and shouted of what he had found. The rest followed him and looked curiously at the immense carved door with the now familiar squid dragon bas-relief. It was, Johansson said, like a great barn door, and they all felt it was a door because of the ornate lintel, threshold and jambs around it, though they could not describe whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and ground were horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result. Then Donovan felt over it delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone moulding. That is, one would call it climbing if the thing were not after all horizontal, and the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. Then, very softly and slowly, the acre great panel began to give inward at the top, and they saw that it was balanced. Donovan slid or somehow propelled himself down or along the jamb and rejoined his fellows, and everybody watched the queer recession of the monstrously carven portal. In this fantasy of prismatic distortion, it moved anonymously in a diagonal way, so that all the rules of matter and perspective seemed upset. The aperture was black, with a darkness almost material. That tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its aeon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping membranous wings. The odour arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he heard a nasty, slopping sound down there. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening still when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poisoned city of madness. Poor Johansen's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks 2 perished of pure fright in that accursed instant. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God, what wonder that across the earth a great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in the telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green, sticky spawn of the stars, had awakened to claim its own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again, and ravening for delight. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anyone turned. God rest them if there be any rest in this universe. They were Donovan, Guerra, and Angstrom. Parker slipped as the other 3 were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas of green-crusted rock to the boat, and Johansen swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there, an angle which was acute but behaved as if it were obtuse. So only Bryden and Johansen reached the boat and pulled desperately for the Alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated, floundering at the edge of the water. Steam had not suffered to go down entirely, despite the departure of all hands for the shore, and it was the work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down between wheel and engines to get the Alert under way. Slowly, amid the distorted horrors of that indescribable scene, she began to churn the lethal waters, whilst on the masonry of that charnel shore, that was not of earth, the Titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered, like Polypheme cursing the fleeing ship of Odysseus. Then, bolder than the storied Cyclops, great Cthulhu slid greasily into the water and began to pursue with vast wave-raising strokes of cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went mad, laughing shrilly as he kept on laughing at intervals till death found him one night in the cabin while Johansen was wandering deliriously. But Johansen had not given out yet. Knowing that the thing could surely overtake the Alert until steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck and reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming in the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian drove his vessel head-on against the pursuing jelly, which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a demon galleon. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansen drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 open graves, and a sound that the chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled by an acrid and blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething astern, where, God in heaven, the scattered plasticity of that nameless sky spawn was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, while its distance widened every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mounting steam. That was all. After that, Johansen only brooded over the idol in the cabin and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. He did not try and navigate after the first bold flight, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. Then came the storm of April 2nd and the gathering of the clouds around his consciousness. There was a sense of spectral whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides through reeling universes on a comet's tail, and of hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon and from the moon back again to the pit, all livened by a cachinating chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. Out of that dream came rescue, the Vigilant, the Vice-Admiralty Court, the streets of Dunedin, and the long voyage back home to the old house by the Egerberg. He could not tell. They would think him mad. He would write of what he knew before death came, but his wife must not guess. Death would be a boon if only it could blot out the memories. That was the document I read, and now I've placed it into the tin box beside the bas-relief and the papers of Professor Angle. With it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterwards be poison to me. But I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansson went, so I shall go. I know too much, and the cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, again in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the Vigilant sailed over the spot after the April storm, but his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or the world would be now screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I cannot and must not think. Let me pray that if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity, and see that it meets no other eye. And that's The Call of the Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. I apologise for any unpleasant descriptions of non-white races. I did try and take as many out as I was going. I think I might have said one or two by accident. I do apologise. I'm not a racist. H.P. Lovecraft was. He was also a very good writer, but not a very good person. So, it's probably time to move on to another story. Oh, for me to crack my back, because it really hurts. That was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I remember reading most of these stories back in the day, but it's been a long time since I've read some of them. So I'm going to read a couple from this book, which is Ghostly by Audrey Niffenegger. It is a collection of ghost stories. It's a really lovely book. It's illustrated by her as well. Don't know if you know her books. She did The Time Traveller's Wife, which was turned into a film, which is very well known. But she also does these gorgeous books that are kind of half her drawings and half prose, and are surreal and dark and weird and lovely all at once. They're very, very nice books and worth having. This will probably be substantially, even as a ghost story, probably substantially lighter than Call of Cthulhu. And then I think I'll try and do one more, and then we'll wrap up for the night. Otherwise we'll be here till midnight, the witching hour. We may yet be here till midnight. But this story is called Secret Life with Cats by Audrey Niffenegger. I don't know why Ruth... Shall I start again? I don't know why Ruth left me her house, with all its attendant complications. Perhaps she sensed that I longed for change and for an adventure. Perhaps she pitied me. Maybe she knew what I would do with such a gift, though I did not know myself. You might think that I was an unlikely heiress. I was 42 years old, married, no kids. My husband Jim was older than me. He was a real estate agent and spent his days stalking through other people's homes, extolling their bathrooms and evaluating their roofs. Houses meant money to Jim. When I met him, he was a tenure-track professor in the anthropology department at Northwestern University. He was 35 and I was 20. I sat in the front row of Methodologies of Urban Ethnography, entranced by his easy, confident lectures, his Brooks Brothers suits, his longish brown hair and sensual green eyes. He was studiously pale in those days, and his hands had never held a hammer, much less a pneumatic staple gun. He gave me a B+ for the semester and asked me out on the last day of class. I'm not a terribly practical person. I was not an asset as a faculty wife. I was too shy, pretty, and had a knack for blurting out non sequiturs to full professors. In the third year of our marriage, Jim was denied tenure, and a year later, after our health insurance was gone, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. Debt piled up. Jim taught part-time at Chicago City Colleges and began selling real estate. At first, real estate was a real stopgap. I would lie on the couch in our tiny South Evanston apartment, bowled from chemo and ravenous from steroids, and Jim would sit with my bloated feet on his lap, wearing his Century 21 vomit yellow jacket. He'd tell me stories. There was the 2-flat with the racing pigeon empire on the roof, the illegal apartment in the basement of a house full of old Haitian tenants who followed Jim and his buyer from room to room but never spoke a word. Jim began every story the same way. Beatrice, you've never seen anything like it. The possessions of the sellers, their bad taste, bad habits, their misconceived notions of what might attract buyers, these fascinated Jim in much the same way as the subject of his ethnographies had once had. He sold his first house and we gloated over the commission. Even though it went directly toward hospital bills, Jim was as hooked as any gambler. He stopped teaching and sold real estate full time. Every house sold was a triumph. I got well. We became solvent, and then we became well off. At the time Ruth bequeathed me her house, can't say bequeathed for some reason, Jim and I had been living in a spacious Victorian on Judson Avenue for 10 years. We'd relentlessly improved it. We'd remodelled the kitchen and the bathrooms, rewired, re-roofed, added a gazebo and a family room, moved and expanded closets, punched new doorways through old walls. Sometimes when I got up in the night to go to the toilet, I got lost. The house was Jim's baby. It was beautiful and ravenous, and he tended to it with the same solicitude he had once lavished on me. The houses he sold fed the house we lived in. As our house became sleek and lovely, I began to fade away. I've aged as pretty blonde girls do. My pink cheeks are too red, my hair is shot with grey, my blue eyes are pale and watery. My skin is chamois soft and there are lines in my face from frowning. My hips have spread and veins have made dark spots on my legs. When Ruth left me a house, all these things were only beginning to happen, and now they are well on their way. Now I don't mind, but at the time I was unhappy because Jim hardly saw me when he looked at me. I couldn't be the mother of his children, and so I'd become the mother of his house. I was in charge of keeping the house. I washed its windows, vacuumed its floors, waxed it and painted it, and helped choose new wallpaper for it. Jim made a point of consulting me about the house. Would I like stainless steel appliances, overstuffed crate and barrel leather chairs, Chinese or Persian carpets, rosewood shoe racks? I didn't really care, and I noticed that Jim tended to wind up doing whatever he wanted anyway. I kept it all clean. Then we hired a cleaning service, and I didn't even do that anymore. I met Ruth at the Happy Cat Home. I realised this is ironic. Jim was allergic to cats, and so I began to volunteer at this no-kill shelter in Rogers Park, just to have something alive to care for. Ruth had been a volunteer for years. She was the first person I met there. The reception room was cinder block ugly and clean. It was full of scratching posts and carpeted cat perches. There was a desk, a folding chair, a bank of filing cabinets and a chintz couch. There was one cat in the room asleep on the couch. He was a Siamese named Reginald who lived at the shelter. Ruth sat at the desk and filled out paperwork with me. I drank coffee out of a styrofoam cup and looked at her while she asked me questions. You have cats at home? Actually, no, my husband's allergic. I had a cat when I was a child. Ruth was small, sharp and quick. Her face was heart-shaped and her eyes were dark. She seemed to me like a silent movie starlet who'd become careless with her looks. She must have been in her 70s then, and her clothes often sported safety pins. Her shoes were always on the verge of splitting from the soles, and there were usually stains on her sleeves. She always had a cup of coffee in hand. She drank it almost white, more milk than coffee. Ruth had an educated voice. If I closed my eyes while she was speaking, I could swear I was listening to NPR. What days can you come in? Any day I'm a housewife. Did I imagine it? Or did Ruth wince when I called myself a housewife? Well, you can work as many hours as you want. We're chronically short of volunteers. What will I be doing? Feeding, scooping out litter pans, running the cats to the vet if you drive, show them to people, try to find them homes. Ruth smiled. And of course there's the socialising, playing with them and petting them. That's the fun part. I smiled back. Perhaps it was then that we began to be friends. I never have had many friends, and I didn't have siblings either. I was so quiet as a girl that other children tended to forget I was there. I liked to lie on my bed and read, or play odd little games with dolls, or watch TV. I had a best friend in high school, but then her family moved to Maryland. In college, my few friends seemed to melt away when I started dating Jim, so I was a little intoxicated by Ruth. It wasn't what she said, so much as how she was. She was confident, but she listened. She was compelling. I'm afraid I'm not doing such a good job of conjuring her up for you. She was like her older sister to me, a clever sister. It was as though we shared a past which there was no need to speak of, about which too much had already been said, even though we'd never really talked about it at all. Ruth had a preternatural ability to divine the desires of the cats and to command them. They flocked to her and deferred to her. They loved her, and so did I. Ruth could feed liquid medicines to cats from a spoon. She'd hold it out to a sick old cat and coo, "Drink up, sweetie." And the cat would make a face and lap the nasty stuff up like a child. Once we had an orange Tom named Lump, who was dying of kidney failure. He hung on, and finally the staff decided it was time to put him down. I was getting ready to drive him to the vet when Ruth came in. She sat down next to the panting cat and whispered in his ear. Lump dragged himself onto her lap, closed his eyes, and died. "What did you say to him?" I asked. Ruth shook her head. "It's private," was all she said. My own relationship with the cats was more difficult. I was a little frightened of them. I tried not to let Ruth see this, but of course she knew. If a cat hissed at me, I froze. When two cats fought, I could only stand helplessly by. Ruth would snap her fingers, and the combatants would slink apart apologetically. The other volunteers sprayed them with squirt guns. I slowly developed a rapport with certain cats. My favourites were Lucky, an earless, balding thing who loved to sit in my lap for hours. Madge, a tortoiseshell who bit everyone but me. And Elvis, a fat blonde cat who followed me everywhere and enjoyed chewing on my wristwatch band. I loved the kittens, but everybody loves kittens. They never stayed around long enough to be memorable. Ruth and I would sit in the lunchroom and play cards, each with a cat on our lap and more curled up around our ankles. We played simple games like hearts and crazy eights. Ruth never told me anything about her life outside the shelter, and I didn't talk about Jim or real estate or our house. One Monday morning I came to work with a black eye. "What happened?" Ruth asked. I walked into a door. This was the truth. I'd gotten up in the middle of the night, thirsty and sleep-fuddled, and collided with one of the recently relocated doors in my search for the bathroom. I could see that Ruth was drawing her own conclusions. No, really, I do that a lot. Ruth looked extremely sceptical. "You don't do it here?" "Yes, well, my husband isn't remodelling the Happy Cat home. He has an insatiable urge to make closets where no closets were before." That was all we said about it. I admit I felt a little glamorous. Without doing a thing, Jim had incurred Ruth's dislike. No one else at the shelter asked me about the black eye, and I imagined Ruth telling them my closet story, which was not even a story, but actually true. That night, Jim came home with steaks. I put one on my eye for a while to please him, and then we ate them. Things went along this way for a few years. Cat came and went. The young pretty ones tended to go, and the old broken ones tended to stay. I got more relaxed and skillful with them. I could give the diabetic cats insulin and clip claws without being scratched. Jim continued to put our house through startling transformations, and finally installed a bathroom right off the master bedroom. Ruth and I went to the movies now and then, but mostly we spent our time at the shelter, wrangling cats and playing cards. And then Ruth died. I don't know how it happened. One Wednesday in July, she didn't show up for her shift at the shelter. No one answered her phone. Jim and I were on vacation in Nova Scotia, so I heard about it the following Monday from Ellie, the director of the shelter. They'd gotten worried, after all. Ruth was old, though she didn't complain about her health. They'd called the emergency number on a volunteer application, but it was disconnected. It had been hot all week in the upper 90s. They went to Ruth's house and rang the bell. No answer. I'd never been to Ruth's house. Ellie said it was a small brick ranch-style place. She went around and looked in all the windows, which were open. No sign of Ruth. The police couldn't find her either. Maybe she went on vacation and just forgot to tell you, ma'am, the officer suggested. Ruth never came back. There was no body, no funeral, no grave. I worried and felt spurned. I couldn't imagine Ruth leaving without saying goodbye. Something terrible must have happened to her, but nobody knew anything. Jim suggested that she might have amnesia, but he liked to listen to radio mystery theatre, and I know that sort of thing only happens in melodramas. At the end of the summer, I got a registered letter at the shelter. I remember holding it in my hand, the weight of it, and put the pause before opening it, my puzzlement as who might send me a letter at work. It was from a downtown law firm, and it informed me that Ruth had died and left me her house and its contents. I'm ashamed to say that my first response was relief. Ruth hadn't abandoned me. She'd only died. That evening, Jim came into the kitchen as I was making my dinner and said, "How was your day?" I opened my mouth to tell him about Ruth, about her house, and I said, "Just a day. How about you?" Sorry, clacky eyes. You won't believe how much of this makeup's all down my shirt and tie. Ruth's house was on Pratt, near Ridge Avenue. It was a 10-minute walk from the Happy Cat home. Jim would have called it a teardown. The house was small and sat far back on a double lot. It was a single-storey brick house, neat and plain, built in the 60s. Elm trees that had somehow eluded Dutch elm disease loomed over it. A sprinkler sat unused in the middle of a beige lawn. I let myself in the front door. The house itself was silent. A shimmer of cicada singing came in the open windows along with a warm breeze. I stood in the entryway and felt like an intruder. This was Ruth's house. Ruth was a very private person. Standing there looking at a couch, a dinette set, a desk, I felt reluctant. But she gave it to you. She wanted you to be here. The thought came into my head as though someone were urging me to accept hospitality. "Come in, come in." I set my purse on an armchair and began to wander slowly through the rooms. Ruth must have furnished her house in the 1970s. All the furniture was teak, or covered in nubby off-white fabric. There were petite throw pillows and a beanbag chair. Her dishes were heavy stoneware, the carpeting was brown shag, everything was somewhat worn. I opened one of the desk drawers. It was empty. There were circles on the windowsills where plants had been. There was nothing in the kitchen cabinets but curling shelf paper, nothing in the bathroom except an extra roll of toilet paper. In the bedroom closet, I found 2 dresses that had belonged to Ruth. I leaned in and smelled them. They smelled like the Happy Cat home. But what about Ruth's cats? There was no cat hair anywhere. No furniture had been clawed. There was no evidence of a litter tray. And yet I remember Ruth sharing stories of her cat's antics. Perhaps whoever had taken the plants and the rest of it had taken the cats too. What were their names? I couldn't remember. I sat down on Ruth's bed. The curtains moved in the breeze. I felt watched. "Thank you," I said to Ruth, in case she could hear me. Then I felt silly. I got my purse and locked up the house and left. I didn't go back for a week. There was no reason to go. I worked my shifts at the shelter, but without Ruth it seemed dull and sad. I sat down one day to eat by myself in the shelter's squalid lunchroom, and suddenly it occurred to me that I could eat at Ruth's house. It was so close. I gathered my food and left. A bus was letting children off on the corner as I walked toward the house. They stared at me and whispered to each other as I let myself in. The house was exactly the same. I sat at the dining room table and ate my yogurt and my tuna sandwich. When I was done, I folded up the Ziploc bags and put them in my purse. It seemed wrong to leave any trash behind, even in the garbage can. I stood in the kitchen looking out at the backyard. There was a small patio with a few old lawn chairs randomly placed, a planter full of dirt. Then I sat on Ruth's bed. I took off my shoes and lay down on top of the bedspread, experimentally. The bed was very soft. I didn't mean to sleep. Even as I was falling asleep, I thought, no, I must get back to work. But I knew I was sleeping already. It was the kind of sleep that's like dropping into a hole. Then I was half awake and had a curious sensation. There was weight on the bed leaning against me, and as I moved in my waking, the weight went to the edge of the bed and fell off. It landed with a thud on the floor. I sat up and looked at the floor, but there was nothing there. I looked at my watch. Only half hour had gone by. I put on my shoes and went back to the shelter. I came back the next day. I decided to turn on the sprinkler and watched it fling water in a circle as I ate lunch. When I walked into the bedroom, there was a dead sparrow on the bed, neatly centred on the pillow I'd used before, and somehow I understood. That evening, Jim and I were eating dinner out on our deck. Jim had recently purchased an elaborate gas grill, so we were eating ribs and grilled vegetables. I knew that I'd be the one who got to scrub the burnt barbecue sauce off the new grill when dinner was over. Jim? He had his mouth full. I'm going to Bowes tomorrow. Bowes was where my mother lived. I'll be back in a week or so. Everything okay? Sure, but it's been a while. Well, give her my love. Okay. That was the last conversation we had. After 21 years of marriage, there's not a lot to say. I left the next morning. I didn't bring many things. A suitcase full of clothing, a few books. I had a checking account Jim didn't know about. I'd been saving my clothing allowance for a long time, not for any particular reason. Just have some money of my own. I took all the evidence of that with me. I bought some groceries. I bought bath towels and dish soap and a small radio. I drove to Ruth's house, now my house, and put the car in the garage. Now I was invisible. No one knew where I was. The first few days were uneventful. I often had the feeling that something was moving at the edge of my vision, a slight blur, a dark shape. I read my books and ate chocolate. I listened to All Things Considered and took long baths. On the third night I woke up suddenly. A large cat was sitting on the bed looking at me. Its eyes reflected pale green. I offered my hand to it. It considered this for a moment, then flicked its tail and jumped off the bed. There was a slight thump as it landed and then silence. I looked all over the room but didn't find it. The next day I put a dish of cat food on the kitchen floor. I watched it for a while. Nothing happened. A few hours later I checked again and the food was gone. The days began to blur together. Purring sounds in my ear. Aluminium foil balls rolling of their own volition across the floor. Invisible cat feet making soft dents in the bedspread. I woke up close to dawn and saw cats swarming around the bedroom, colourless in the half-light, an uncountable number of them. I was afraid then. A few days later I was vacuuming the living room when I noticed something dark on the white wall. I got on my knees to look at it. It was writing, small and cramped. It said, "You could probably levitate if you wanted to." The thing that frightened me and thrilled me is that the words were so low to the ground, just above the baseboard. I stood up. The house seemed expectant. I didn't know if I wanted to levitate. I'd never thought about it. I went outside and stood on the patio. After a while I went back inside. Curtains were moving slightly in the breeze, otherwise the house was still. There was a feeling of disappointment, but I did not know if it was mine or someone else's. I'd been living in the house for 2 weeks. It was early evening. I was curled up on the couch reading the newspaper. It was October and chilly. I'd closed all the windows and turned on the heat. I was content. I'd begun to distinguish between aloneness and loneliness. In Ruth's house I was alone. The phantom cats and NPR were company enough. But I wasn't lonely. And I realised only by this how lonely I'd been before. Now I had the familiar sense of being watched. I put down the newspaper. There was a white cat sitting in the armchair. It was very thin, with green eyes and a rather haughty manner. We stared at each other. It seemed to be considering me, judging me. "Well, come on then," it said. It rose, stretched, jumped to the floor and stood looking at me expectantly. When I didn't get up instantly, it turned its back and marched off towards the bedroom. I hesitated, then followed it. The closet stood open. I'd hung a few dresses and skirts next to Ruth's. These had been pushed aside, and at the back of the closet was now another doorway. I couldn't think I would fail to notice this door. The white cat stalked through it and I followed. There were stairs, which led down. The house was built on a concrete slab. These stairs had no business being here. There was hardly any light, and I felt my way with hands touching the walls and my feet seeking each step before advancing. The walls and the steps seemed to be made of earth. Sound was deadened. I had no idea if the white cat was still with me. I went down, and finally there were no more stairs. I was in a hallway which led to a door. The white cat sat in front of the door with its tail twitching. "There you are. You're very slow." It nudged open the door and disappeared through it. I followed. The room was big and low-ceilinged. It smelt of earth and unbathed flesh, meat, baby powder, damp wood, old sweaters. The room was full of things in no order at all, and cats were everywhere. Cats were playing, napping, eating, yawning, fighting. They were doing all of this in the midst of shoes, hats, dresses, books, dead plants, papers, a typewriter, a few small lamps with chewed cords, underwear, knickknacks, a footstool, a child's rocking chair, suitcases, combs, a toothbrush. All of the things that had been missing from Ruth's house were here. Some of the cats wore pieces of costume jewellery I remembered seeing on Ruth. They all ignored me, or pretended to ignore me. The white cat was nowhere to be seen, and I wondered why I'd been brought down here. The disorder was oppressive. I felt large. At first I thought I was the only thing in the room over 2 feet tall. "Hello, Beatrice." Her voice came from a dark corner. I took a step forward and stopped. Where was she? Ruth was sitting in a metal folding chair, the kind people take to parades. She was wrapped in a blanket. All I could see of her was her face. Ruth looked tired, but otherwise not too different from when I'd seen her last. "Ruth, I was so worried about you. What are you doing down here? Are you okay?" I was so relieved to see her and so confused. I edged a little closer. Ruth chuckled. It was such a familiar sound. It evoked all those games of Crazy Eights in the Happy Cat House lunchroom. "Well, darling, I don't think I would exactly describe myself as okay. I'm dead after all, so okay is a little beside the point, don't you think?" But I remembered that I had no idea who she'd died. It wasn't that big of a deal. I slipped and cracked my head on the bathtub. It was very tidy. Ruth's voice was kind, but I could tell she thought I was focusing on the wrong thing. Barking up the wrong tree would have been her way of putting it. "Yes, but Ruth, no one could find you. We checked, we looked for you, but you'd just vanished." I know I sounded a little petulant, but I couldn't help it. Ruth smiled as though she was proud of how she'd mystified us. "That's right, they couldn't find me because the cats ate me." "Ate you?" "Yep, every little bit of me. Such a cliche, isn't it? But they didn't do it for the usual reasons. They weren't hungry, they weren't locked in the house. They did it to bring me down here with them, so that we could be together." The longer I stood here listening to Ruth in this dark, smelly, chaotic room, the more revolted and sad I felt. The cats had gradually stopped milling around. Now they sat silently listening. Ruth waited for me to respond. Finally I said, "Won't you come upstairs? We could be together. With the cats too, of course." There was a deep stillness among the cats now as they waited to hear what Ruth would say. "Oh, Bea, I wish I could, I really do. Remember how much fun we had?" Ruth smiled, and I thought, she's the only person I've ever truly loved. "BC," she continued, still smiling, "I can't do that. I belong here now with my sweeties." There was an audible hum in the room, all the cats purring. Plus, I'm afraid I'm not exactly ambulatory. "Why not?" I asked without thinking. "Well, they are cats after all. They aren't doctors or mechanics. I'm afraid they did a rather poor job of reassembling me." Ruth nodded at her own blanket-wrapped form. The cats looked at her, anxious, loving. "We tried, Ruth," said the white cat, who had reappeared and was sitting at her feet. "I know you did, Thaddeus," said Ruth in her most gentle voice. The cats began to surge around her, rubbing against her blanket, with sorrowful expressions on their faces. I stood there watching, at a loss. Tears ran down my face. Oh God, Ruth, what can I do? She looked back at me calmly. I don't think there's much you can do, darling. But how are you? How do you like the house? You're living here now, aren't you? I had a sudden vision of myself living in Ruth's house, calmly going about my life upstairs while she was down here with the cats. I cried out, turned and stumbled towards the door. Ruth called out, "Beatrice, wait!" But I ran up the stairs without answering her. I could hear the cats hissing. I reached the closet and slammed the door behind me. Within minutes I was in my car driving blindly down Pratt, away from Ruth and her house, away from those cats. I sold the house to a developer. It was on the market for 2 days. A few weeks later, Ruth's house was a pile of rubble, and I was driving to New Mexico. I bought a condo in Albuquerque, filed for a divorce, and got a German Shepherd puppy named Millie. I think about Ruth a lot, but it's too late to change anything. And though I've tried to levitate, I can't do it. It's probably just as well. I think that's a lovely little story. I'll do one more. I'm going to have a little drink of something first. This story is Honeysuckle Cottage by P.G. Wodehouse. I'm reading this for someone who I know likes P.G. Wodehouse very much. Do you believe in ghosts? Asked Mr. Mulliner abruptly. I weighed the question thoughtfully. I was a little surprised, for nothing in our previous conversation had suggested the topic. Well, I replied, I don't like them, if that's what you mean. I was once butted by one as a child. Ghosts, not goats. Oh, ghosts. Do I believe in ghosts? Exactly. Well, yes and no. Let me put it another way, said Mr. Mulliner patiently. Do you believe in haunted houses? Do you believe that it's possible for a malign influence to envelop a place and work a spell on all that come within its radius? I hesitated. Well, no, and yes. Mr. Mulliner sighed a little. He seemed to be wondering if I was always as bright as this. Of course, I went on, one has read stories. Henry James's Turn of the Screw. I'm not talking about fiction. Well, in real life. Well, look here. As a matter of fact, I did meet a fellow who knew a man. My distant cousin James Morodman spent some weeks in a haunted house, said Mr. Mulliner, who, if he has a fault, is not a very good listener. It cost him £5,000. That is to say, he sacrificed £5,000 by not remaining there. Did you ever, he asked, wandering it seemed to me from the subject, hear of Leela J. Pickney? Naturally, I'd heard of Leela J. Pickney. Her death some years ago diminished her vogue, but at one time it was impossible to pass a bookshelf or a railway bookstore without seeing a long row of her novels. I'd never myself actually read any of them, but I knew that in her particular line of literature, the squashily sentimental, she had always been regarded by those entitled to judge as preeminent. The critics usually headed their reviews of her stories with the words, "Another Pinkney," or sometimes, more offensively, "Another Pinkney!" 3 exclamation points. And once, dealing with, I think, The Love Which Prevails, which which the literary expert of the Scrutinizer had compressed her entire critique into a single phrase. Oh, God. Of course, I said. But what about her? She was James Rodman's aunt. Yes. And when she died, James found out that she'd left him £5,000 and the house in the country where she'd lived for the last 20 years of her life. A very nice little legacy. 20 years, repeated Mr. Mulliner. Grasp that, for it has a vital bearing on what follows. 20 years, mind you, and Miss Pinkney turned out 2 novels and 12 short stories regularly every year, besides a monthly page of advice to young girls in one of the magazines. That is to say, 40 of her novels and no fewer than 240 of her short stories were written under the roof of Honeysuckle Cottage. A pretty name. A nasty, sloppy name, said Mr. Mulliner severely, which should have warned my distant cousin James from the start. Have you a pencil and a piece of paper? He scribbled for a while, pouringly frowning over columns of figures. Yes, he said, looking up. If my calculations are correct, Juliet... I'm going to have trouble with his name all the way through, I can see. Leila J. Pinkney wrote all a matter of 9,140,000 words of gluttonous sentimentality at Honeysuckle Cottage, and it was a condition of her will that James should reside there for 6 months in every year. Failing to do this, he was to forfeit the £5,000. It must be great fun making a freak will, I mused. I often wish I was rich enough to do it. This was not a freak will. The conditions are perfectly understandable. James Rodman was a writer of sensational mystery stories, and his Aunt Leila had always disapproved of his work. She was a great believer in the influence of environment, and the reason why she inserted that clause in her will was that she wished to compel James to move from London to the country. She considered that living in London hardened him and made his outlook on life sordid. She often asked him if he thought it quite nice to harp on such a sudden death and blackmailers with squints. Surely, she said, there were enough squinting blackmailers in the world without writing about them. The fact that literature meant such different things to these two had, I believe, caused something of a coolness between them, and James had never dreamed he would be remembered in his aunt's will, for he never concealed his opinion that Leila J. Pinkney's style of writing revolted him, however dear it might be to her enormous public. He held rigid views on the art of the novel, and always maintained that an artist with true reverence for his craft should not descend to gooey love stories, but should stick austerely to revolvers, cries in the night, missing papers, mysterious Chinamen and dead bodies, with or without gash in throat. And not even the thought that his aunt had dandied him on his knee as a baby could induce him to stifle his literary conscience to the extent of pretending to enjoy her work. First, last, and all the time, James Rodman had held the opinion, and voiced it fearlessly, that Leila J. Pinkney wrote bilge. It was a surprise to him, therefore, to find that he'd been left this legacy. A pleasant surprise, of course. James was making quite a decent outcome out of the 3 novels and 18 short stories which he produced annually, but an author can always find a use for £5,000. And as for the cottage, he'd actually been looking about for a little place in the country at the very moment when he received the lawyer's letter. In less than a week, he was installed at his new residence. I like that look so much, I'm going to do it again. James's... Sorry. James's first impressions of... It was inevitable. It was inevitable I was going to get the giggles. I've got a face like a skeleton and I'm laughing. It's Halloween. Be frightened, not amused. James's first impressions of Honeysuckle Cottage were, he tells me, wholly favourable. He was delighted with the place. It was a low, rambling, picturesque old house with funny little chimneys and a red roof, placed in the middle of the most charming country, with its oak beams, its trim garden, its trilling birds and its rose-hung porch. It was the ideal spot for a writer. It was just the sort of place, he reflected whimsically, which his aunt had loved to write about in her books. Even the apple-cheeked old housekeeper who attended to his needs might have stepped straight out of one of them. It seemed to James that his lot had been cast in pleasant places. He brought down his books, his pipes, and his golf clubs, and was hard at work, finishing the best thing he'd ever done. The Secret 9 was the title of it, and on the beautiful summer afternoon on which the story opens, he was in his study, hammering away at his typewriter at peace with the world. The machine was running sweetly. The new tobacco he'd bought the day before was proving admirable, and he was moving on all 6 cylinders to the end of a chapter. He shoved in a fresh sheet of paper, chewed his pipe thoughtfully a moment, and then wrote rapidly. For an instant, Lester Gage thought that he must have been mistaken. Then the noise came again, faint but unmistakable, a soft scratching on the outer panel. His mouth set in a grim line. Silently, like a panther, he made one quick step to the desk, noiselessly opened a drawer, drew out his automatic. After that affair of the poisoned needle, he was taking no chances. Still in dead silence, he tiptoed to the door, then, flinging it open, he stood there, his weapon poised. On the mat stood the most beautiful girl he'd ever beheld, a veritable child of fairy. She eyed him for a moment with a saucy smile, and then with a pretty roguish look of reproof shook a dainty forefinger at him. "I believe you've forgotten me, Mr. Gage," she fluted with a mock severity which her eyes belied. James stared at the paper dumbly. He was utterly perplexed. He had not the slightest intention of writing anything like this. To begin with, it was a rule with him, and one which he never broke, to allow no girls to appear in his stories. Sinister landladies, yes, and naturally any amount of adventuresses with foreign accents, but never under any pretext what may be broadly described as girls. A detective story, he maintained, should have no heroine. Heroines only held up the action and tried to flirt with the hero when he should have been busy looking for clues, and then went and let the villain kidnap them by some childishly simple trick. In his writing, James was positively monastic, and yet here was this creature with her saucy smile and a dainty forefinger, horning in at the most important part in the story. It was uncanny. He looked once more at his scenario. No, the scenario was all right. In perfectly plain words, it stated that what happened when the door opened was that a dying man fell in, and after gasping, "The Beetle, tell Scotland Yard that the Blue Beetle is," expired on the hearthrug, leaving Lester Gage not unnaturally somewhat mystified. Nothing whatsoever about beautiful girls. In a curious mood of irritation, James scratched out the offending passage, wrote in the necessary connections, and put the cover on the machine. It was at this point that he heard William whining. The only blot on this paradise which James had so far been able to discover was the infernal dog William. Belonging nominally to the gardener, on the very first morning he had adopted James by acclamation, and he maddened and infuriated James. He had a habit of coming and whining under the window when James was at work. The latter would ignore this as long as he could. Then when the thing became insupportable, would bound out of his chair to see the animal standing on the gravel, gazing expectantly up at him with a stone in its mouth. William had a weak-minded passion for chasing stones, and on the first day James, in a rash spirit of camaraderie, had flung one for him. Since then James had thrown no more stones, but he had thrown any number of other solids, and the garden was littered with objects ranging from matchboxes to a plaster statuette of the young Joseph proselytizing before Pharaoh, and still William came and whined, an optimist to the last. The whining, coming now at a moment when he felt irritable and unsettled, acted on James much as the scratching on the door had acted on Lester Gage. Silently, like a panther, he made one quick step to the mantelpiece, removed from it a china mug bearing the legend, "A present from Clacton-on-Sea," and crept to the window. As he did so, a voice outside said, "Go away, sir, go away," and there followed a short, high-pitched bark, which was certainly not William's. William was a mixture of Airedale, Setter, Bull Terrier, and Mastiff, and when in a vocal mood, favoured the Mastiff side of his family. James peered out. There on the porch stood a girl in blue. She held in her arms a small, fluffy white dog, and she was endeavouring to foil the upward movement towards this of the blackguard William. William's mentality had been arrested some years before, at the point when he imagined everything in the world had been created for him to eat. A bone, a boot, a steak, the back wheel of a bicycle, it was all one to William. If it were there, he tried to eat it. He'd even made a plucky attempt to devour the remains of the young Joseph proselytizing before Pharaoh, and it was perfectly plain now that he regarded the curious wriggling object in the girl's arms purely in the light of a snack to keep body and soul together till dinner time. "William!" bellowed James. William looked courteously over his shoulder with eyes that beamed the pure light of a life's devotion, wagged the whip-like tail which he had inherited from his bull terrier ancestor, and resumed his intense scrutiny of the fluffy dog. "Oh, please," cried the girl, "this great rough dog is frightening poor Toto." The man of letters and the man of action do not always go hand in hand, but practice had made James perfect with handling in swift efficiency any situation that involved William. A moment later, that canine moron, having received a present from the Clacton in the short ribs, was scuttling round the corner of the house, and James had jumped through the window and was facing the girl. She was an extraordinarily pretty girl. Very sweet and fragile she looked as she stood there under the honeysuckle, with the breeze ruffling a tendril of golden hair that strayed from beneath her coquettish little hat. Her eyes were very big and very blue, her rose-tinted face becoming flushed. All wasted on James, though. He disliked all girls, and particularly the sweet, droopy type. "Did you want to see somebody?" he asked stiffly. "Just the house," said the girl, "if it wouldn't be giving anyone any trouble. I do so want to see the room where Miss Pinckney wrote her books." Miss Pinckney wrote her books. "This is where Lelia J. Pinckney used to live, isn't it?" "Yes, I'm a nephew. My name is James Rodman." "Mine is Rose Maynard." James led the way into the house, and she stopped with a cry of delight on the threshold of the morning room. "Oh, how too perfect!" she cried. "So this was her study?" "Yes." "What a wonderful place it would be for just you to think in if you were a writer too." James held no high opinion of women's literary taste, but nevertheless he was conscious of an unpleasant shock. "I am a writer," he said coldly. "I write detective stories." I'm afraid—" She blushed. "I'm afraid I don't often read detective stories." "You no doubt prefer," said James still more coldly, "the sort of thing my aunt used to write." "Oh, I love her stories," cried the girl, clasping her hands ecstatically. "Don't you?" "I cannot say that I do." "What?" "They are pure applesauce," said James sternly. "Just nasty blobs of sentimentality, thoroughly untrue to life." The girl stared. "Well, that's what's so wonderful about them. Their trueness to life. You feel like they all might have happened. I don't understand what you mean." They were walking down the garden now. James held the gate open for her and she passed through into the road. "Well, for one thing," he said, "I decline to believe that a marriage between two young people is invariably preceded by some violent and sensational experience in which they both share." "Are you thinking of Scent of the Blossom, where Edgar saves Maud from drowning?" "I'm thinking of every single one of my aunt's books." He looked at her curiously. He'd just got the solution of a mystery which had been puzzling him for some time. Almost from the moment he'd set eyes on her, she'd seemed somehow strangely familiar. It now came to him why it was that he disliked her so much. "Do you know," he said, "you might be one of my aunt's heroines yourself. You're just the sort of girl she used to love to write about." Her face lit up. "Oh, do you really think so?" She hesitated. "Do you know what I've been feeling ever since I came here? I've been feeling that you're exactly like one of Miss Pinckney's heroes." "No, I say really," said James, revolted. "Oh, but you are. When you jumped through that window, it gave me quite a start. You were so exactly like Claude Masterson in Heather of the Hills." "I have not read Heather of the Hills," said James with a shudder. He was very strong and quiet, with deep, dark, sad eyes. James did not explain that his eyes were sad because of society gave him a pain in the neck. He merely laughed scornfully. "So now, I suppose," he said, "a car will come and knock you down, and I shall carry you gently in the house, and lay— Look at—" It was too late. She was lying in a little huddled heap at his feet. Round the corner a large automobile had come bowling, keeping with almost affected precision to the wrong side of the road. It was now receding into the distance, the occupant of the tonneau, a stout, red-faced gentleman in a fur coat, leaning out over the back. He'd bared his head, not one fears as a pretty gesture of respect and regret, but because he was using his hat to hide his number plate. The dog Toto was unfortunately uninjured. James carried the girl gently into the house and laid her on the sofa in the morning room. He rang the bell and the apple-cheeked housekeeper appeared. "Send for the doctor," said James. "There's been an accident." The housekeeper bent over the girl. "Eh, dearie, dearie," she said. "Bless her sweet, pretty face." I don't know what accent that was. The gardener, who technically owned William, was routed out from among the young lettuces and told to fetch Dr. Brady. He separated his bicycle from William, who was making a light meal of the left pedal, and departed on his mission. Dr. Brady arrived, and in due course he made his... Try that sentence again with my teeth in. Dr. Brady arrived, and in due course he made his report. No bones broken, but a number of nasty bruises, and of course the shock. "She'll have to stay here for some time, Rodman. Can't be moved." "Stay here? But she can't. It isn't proper." "Your housekeeper will act as chaperone." The doctor sighed. He was a solid-looking man of middle age and side whiskers. "A beautiful girl, that, Rodman," he said. "I suppose so," said James. "A sweet, beautiful girl. An elfin child." "A what?" said James, starting. This imagery was very foreign to Dr. Bradley, as he knew him, Dr. Brady, as he knew him. On the only previous occasion on which they'd had any extended conversation, the doctor had talked exclusively about the effect of too much protein on the gastric juices. An elfin child, a tender, fairy creature. When I was looking at her just now, Rodman, I nearly broke down. Her little hand lay on the coverlets like some white lily floating on the surface of a still pool, and her dear, trusting eyes gazed up at me. He pottered off down the garden, still babbling, and James stood staring after him blankly. And slowly, like some cloud athwart a summer sky, there crept over James's heart the chill shadow of a nameless fear. It was about a week later that Mr. Andrew McKinnon, the senior partner in the well-known firm of literary agents, McKinnon and Gooch, sat in his office in Chancery Lane, frowning thoughtfully over a telegram. He rang the bell. "Ask Mr. Gooch to step in here." He resumed his study of the telegram. "Oh, Gooch," he said when the partner appeared. "Just had a curious wire from young Rodman. He seems to want to see me very urgently." Mr. Gooch read the telegram. "Written under the influence of strong mental excitement," he agreed. "I wonder why he doesn't come to the office if he wants to see you so badly." "He's working very hard, finishing that novel for Prodder and Wiggs. Can't leave it, I suppose. Well, it's a nice day. If you look after things here, I think I'll motor down and let him give me lunch." As Mr. McKinnon's car reached the crossroads a mile from Honeysuckle Cottage, he was aware of a gesticulating figure by the hedge. He stopped the car. "Morning, Rodman." "Thank God you've come," said James. It seemed to Mr. McKinnon that the young man looked paler and thinner. "Would you mind walking the rest of the way? There's something I want to speak to you about." Mr. McKinnon alighted, and James, as he glanced at him, felt cheered and encouraged by the very sight of the man. The literary agent was a grim, hard-bitten person, to whom, when he called at their offices to arrange terms, editors kept their faces turned so they might at least retain their back collar studs. There was no sentiment in Andrew McKinnon. Editress of society papers practised their blandishments on him in vain, and many a publisher had waked, screaming in the night, dreaming he was signing a McKinnon contract. "Well, Rodman," he said, "Prodder and Wiggs have agreed to our terms. I was writing to tell you, sir, when your wire arrived. I had a lot of trouble with them, but it's fixed at 20%, rising to 25%, and £200 advance royalties on day of publication." "Good," said James absently. "Good. McKinnon, do you remember my aunt, Lelia J. Pinkney?" "Remember her? Why, I was her agent all her life." "Of course. Then you know the sort of tripe she wrote." "No author," said Mr. McKinnon reprovingly, "who pulls down a steady £20,000 a year writes tripe." "Well, anyway, you know her stuff. Who better? When she died, she left me £5,000 in her house, Honeysuckle Cottage. I'm living there now. McKinnon, do you believe in haunted houses?" "No." "Yet I tell you solemnly that Honeysuckle Cottage is haunted." "By your aunt?" said Mr. Kinnon, surprised. "By her influence. There's a malignant spell over the place, a sort of miasma of sentimentalism. Everyone who enters it succumbs." "Tut, tut, you mustn't have these fancies." "They aren't fancies. You aren't seriously meaning to tell me—" "Well, how do you account for this? That book you were speaking about, which Prodder and Wiggs are to publish, The Secret Nine. Every time I sit down to write it, a girl keeps trying to sneak in." "Into the room? Into the story?" "You don't want a love interest in your sort of book," said Mr. McKinnon, shaking his head. "It delays the action." "I know it does, and every day I have to keep shooting this infernal female out. An awful girl, McKinnon, a soppy, soupy, treacly, drooping girl with a roguish smile. This morning she tried to butt in on the scene where Lester Gage is trapped in the den of the mysterious leper." "No." "She did, I assure you. I had to rewrite 3 pages before I could get her out of it. And that's not the worst. Do you know, McKinnon, that at this moment I'm actually living the plot of a typical Leela May Pinkney novel in just the setting she was used, and I can see the happy ending coming nearer every day. A week ago a girl was knocked down by a car at my door. I've had to put her up, and every day I realise it more clearly that sooner or later I'll have to ask her to marry me." "Don't do it," said Mr. McKinnon, a stout bachelor. "You're too young to marry." "So was Methuselah," said James, a stouter. "But all the same, I know I'm going to do it. It's the influence of this awful house weighing upon me. I feel like an eggshell in a maelstrom. I'm being sucked on by a force too strong for me to resist. This morning I found myself kissing her dog." "No." "I did, and I loathe the little beast. Yesterday I got up at dawn and plucked a nosegay of flowers for her, wet with the dew." "Rodman." "It's a fact. I laid them at her door and went downstairs kicking myself all the way. And there in the hall was the apple-cheeked housekeeper regarding me archly. She didn't murmur, "Bless their sweet young hearts, then my ears deceive me. Why don't you pack up and leave? If I do, I'll lose the £5,000. Ah, said Mr. McKinnon. I can understand what's happened. It's the same with all haunted houses. My aunt's subliminal ether vibrations have woven themselves into the texture of the place, creating an atmosphere which forces the ego of all who come into contact with to attune themselves to it. It's either that or something to do with the fourth dimension. Mr. McKinnon laughed scornfully. Tut tut, he said again. This is pure imagination. What's happened is you've been working too hard. You'll see this precious atmosphere of yours will have no effect on me. That's exactly why I asked you to come down. I hoped you might break the spell. The fact that the literary agent spoke little at lunch caused James no apprehension. Mr. McKinnon was ever a silent trencherman. From time to time, James caught him stealing a glance at the girl, who was well enough to come down to meals now, limping pathetically, but he could read nothing in his face. And yet the mere look of his face was consolation. It was so solid, so matter-of-fact, so exactly like an unemotional coconut. You've done me good, said James with a sigh of relief as he escorted the agent down the garden to his car after lunch. I felt all along I could rely on your rugged common sense. The whole atmosphere of the place seems different now. Mr. McKinnon did not speak for a moment. He seemed to be plunged in thought. Rodman, he said as he got into his car, I've been thinking over that suggestion of yours about putting a love interest into the sinker at 9. I think you're wise. The story needs it. After all, what is there greater in the world than love? Love. Love. Aye, it's the sweetest word in the language. Put in a heroine and let her marry Lester Gage. If, said James grimly, she does succeed in worming her in, she'll jolly well marry the mysterious leper. But look here, I don't understand. It was seeing that young girl that changed me, proceeded Mr. McKinnon. And as James stared at him aghast, tears suddenly filled his hard-boiled eyes. He openly snuffled. Aye, seeing her there under the roses, all that smell of honeysuckle and all, and the birdies singing so sweet in the garden and the sun lighting up her bonny face. The poor wee lass, he muttered, dabbing at his eyes. The poor bonny wee lass, Rodman, he said, his voice quivering. I've decided that we're being hard on Prodder and Wiggs. Wiggs has had sickness in his home lately. We mustn't be hard on a man who's had sickness in his home, hey, laddie? No, I'm going to take back that contract and I'll alter it to a flat 12% and no advance royalties. What? But you shan't lose by it, Rodman. No, you shan't lose by my money. I'm going to waive my commission. The poor bonny wee lass. The car rolled off down the road. Mr. McKinnon, seated in the back, was blowing his nose violently. This is the end, said James. It's necessary at this point to pause and examine James Rodman's position with an unbiased eye. The average man, unless he puts himself in James's place, will be unable to appreciate it. James, he will feel, was making a lot of fuss about nothing. Here he was, drawing daily closer and closer to a charming girl with big blue eyes, and surely rather to be envied than pitied. But we must remember that James was one of nature's bachelors, and no ordinary man looking forward dreamily to a little home of his own with a loving wife, putting out his slippers and changing the gramophone records, can realise the intensity of the instinct for self-preservation which animates nature's bachelors in times of peril. James Rodman has a congenital horror of matrimony. Though a young man, he's allowed himself to develop a great many habits which were as the breath of life to him, and these habits he knew instinctively a wife would shoot to pieces within a week of the end of the honeymoon. James liked to breakfast in bed, and, having breakfasted, to smoke in bed and knock the ashes out on the carpet. What wife would tolerate this practice? James liked to pass his days in a tennis shirt, grey flannel trousers and slippers. What wife ever rests until she's enclosed her husband in a stiff collar, tight boots and a morning suit and taken him with her to these musicales? These and 1,000 other thoughts of the same kind flashed through the unfortunate young man's mind as the days went by, and every day that passed seemed to draw him nearer to the brink of the chasm. Fate appeared to be taking a malicious pleasure in making things as difficult for him as possible. Now that the girl was well enough to leave her bed, she spent her time sitting in the chair on the sun-sprinkled porch, and James had to read to her, and poetry at that. And not the jolly, wholesome sort of poetry the boys are turning out nowadays either, good honest stuff about sin and gasworks and decaying corpses, but the old-fashioned kind with rhymes in it, dealing almost exclusively with love. The weather, moreover, continued superb. The honeysuckle cast its sweet scent on the gentle breeze, the roses over the porch stirred and nodded, the flowers in the garden were lovelier than ever, the birds sang their little throats sore, and every evening there was a magnificent sunset. It was almost as if nature was doing it on purpose. At last, James intercepted Dr. Brady as he was leaving after one of his visits and put the thing to him squarely. "When is that girl going?" The doctor patted him on the arm. "Not yet, Rodman," he said in a low, understanding voice. "No need to worry yourself about that. It mustn't be moved for days and days and days. I'd almost say weeks and weeks and weeks." "Weeks and weeks," cried James. "And weeks," said Dr. Brady. He prodded James roguishly in the abdomen. "Good luck to you, my boy. Good luck to you," he said. It was some small consolation to James that the mushy physician immediately afterward tripped over William on his way up the path and broke his stethoscope. When a man is up against it like James, every little helps. He was walking dismally back to the house after this conversation when he was met by the apple-cheeked housekeeper. "The little lady would like to speak to you, sir," said the apple-cheeked exhibit, rubbing her hands. "Would she?" said James hollowly. "So sweet and pretty she looks, sir. Oh, sir, you wouldn't believe, like a blessed angel sitting there with her dear eyes all a-shining." "Don't do it," cried James with extraordinary vehemence. "Don't do it." He found the girl propped up on the cushions and thought once again how singularly he disliked her. And yet, even as he thought this, some force against which he had to fight madly was whispering to him, "Go to her and take that little hand. Breathe into that little ear the burning words that'll make that little face turn away crimson with blushes." He wiped a bead of perspiration from his forehead and sat down. "Mrs. Stuck in the Mud, what's her name, says you want to see me." The girl nodded. "I've had a letter from Uncle Henry. I wrote him as soon as I was better and told him what had happened, and he's coming here tomorrow morning." "Uncle Henry?" "That's what I call him, but he's really no relation. He's my guardian. He and Daddy were officers in the same regiment, and when Daddy was killed fighting on the Afghan frontier, he died in Uncle Henry's arms and with his last breath begged him to take care of me." James started. A sudden, wild hope had waked in his heart. Years ago, he remembered he'd read a book of his aunt's entitled Rupert's Legacy, and in that book, "I'm engaged to marry him," said the girl quietly. "Wow!" shouted James. "What?" asked the girl, startled. "Touch a cramp," said James. He was thrilling all over. That wild hope had been realised. "It was Daddy's dying wish that we should marry," said the girl. "And dashed sensible of him too, dashed sensible," said James warmly. "And yet," she went on a little wistfully, "I sometimes wonder—" "Don't," said James, "don't. You must respect Daddy's dying wish. There's nothing like Daddy's dying wish. You can't beat it. So he's coming here tomorrow, is he? Capital, capital. To lunch, I suppose. Excellent. I'll run down and tell Mrs. Who's-it to lay in another chop." It was with a gay and uplifted heart that James strolled the garden and smoked his pipe the next morning. A great cloud seemed to have rolled itself away from him. Everything was for the best, in the best of all possible worlds. He'd finished The Secret Line and shipped it off to Mackinnon, and now as he strolled there was shaping itself in his mind a corking plot about a man with only half a face who lived in a secret den and terrorised London with a series of shocking murders. And what made them so shocking was the fact that each of the victims, when discovered, was found to only have half a face too. The rest had been chipped off, presumably by some blunt instrument. The thing was coming along magnificently, and suddenly his attention was diverted by a piercing scream. Out of the bushes fringing the river that ran beneath the garden burst the apple-cheeked housekeeper. "Oh, sir, oh, sir, oh, sir!" "What is it?" demanded James irritably. "Oh, sir, oh, sir!" "Yes, and then what?" "The little dog, sir, he's in the river." "Well, whistle him to come out." "Oh, sir, do come quick, he'll be drowned." James followed her through the bushes, taking off his coat as he went. He was saying to himself, "I will not rescue the dog. I do not like the dog. It is high time he had a bath. In any case, it would be simpler to stand on the bank and fish for him with a rake. Only an arse out of a Lelia J. Pickney book would dive into the beastly river to save." At this point he dived. Toto, alarmed by the splash, swam rapidly for the bank, but James was too quick for him. Grasping him firmly by the neck, he scrambled ashore and ran for the house, followed by the housekeeper. The girl was seated on the porch. Over her there bent the tall, soldierly figure of a man with keen eyes and greying hair. The housekeeper raced up. "Oh, miss, Toto, in the river. He saved him. He plunged in and saved him." The girl drew a quick breath. "Gallant, damn, by Jove, by Gad, yes, gallant, by George!" exclaimed the soldierly man. The girl seemed to wake from a reverie. "Uncle Henry, this is Mr. Rodman. Mr. Rodman, my guardian, Colonel Carteret." "Proud to meet you, sir," said the colonel, his honest blue eyes glowing as he fingered his crisp, short moustache. "As fine a thing as I've ever heard of, Dan." "Yes, you are brave, brave," the girl whispered. "I am wet, said James, and went upstairs to change his clothes. When he came down for lunch, he found to his relief that the girl had decided not to join them, and Colonel Carteret was silent and preoccupied. James, exerting himself in his capacity as host, tried him with the weather, golf, India, the government, the high cost of living, first-class cricket, the modern dancing craze, and murderers he had met, but the other still preserved that strange, absent-minded silence. It was only when the meal was concluded and James had produced cigarettes that he came abruptly out of his trance. "Rodman," he said, "I should like to speak to you." "Yes," said James, thinking it was about time. "Rodman," said Colonel Carteret, "or rather George. May I call you George?" he added with a sort of wistful diffidence that had a singular charm. "Certainly," replied James, "if you wish it. Then my name is James." "James, eh? Well, it amounts to the same thing, eh? What damn begad?" said the Colonel, with momentary return of his bluff, soldierly manner. "Well then, James, I have something I wish to say to you. Miss Maynard, did Rose happen to tell you anything about myself in connection with herself? She mentioned that you were engaged to be married." The Colonel's tightly drawn lips quivered. "No longer," he said. "What?" "No, John, my boy. James. No, James, my boy. No longer. While you were upstairs changing her clothes, she told me, breaking down, poor child, as she spoke, that she wished our engagement to be at an end." James half rose from the table. His cheeks blanched. "You don't mean that," he gasped. Colonel Carteret nodded. He was staring out of the window, his fine eyes set in a look of pain. "But this is nonsense," cried James. "This is absurd. She mustn't be allowed to chop and change like this. I mean to say, it isn't fair." "Don't think of me, my boy." "I'm not. I mean, did she give any reason?" "Her eyes did." "Her eyes did?" "Her eyes, when she looked at you on the porch as you stood there, young, heroic, having just saved the life of the dog she loves. It's you who won that tender heart, my boy." "Now listen," protested James. "You aren't going to sit there and tell me that a girl falls in love with a man just because he saves her dog from drowning?" "Why, surely," said Colonel Carteret, surprised. "What better reason could she have?" He sighed. "It is the old, old story, my boy. Youth to youth. I'm an old man. I should have known. I should have foreseen. Yes, youth to youth." "You aren't a bit old." "Yes, yes. No, no. Yes, yes. Don't keep saying on yes, yes," cried James, clutching at his hair. "Besides, she wants a steady old buffer, a steady, sensible man of medium age to look after her." Colonel Carteret shook his head with a gentle smile. "This is mere quixotry, my boy. It's splendid of you to take this attitude, but no, no. Yes, yes. No, no." He gripped James's hand for an instant, then rose and walked to the door. "That's all I wish to say, Tom. James, I just thought you ought to know how matters stood. Go to her, my boy. Go to her, and don't let any thought of an old man's broken dream keep you from pouring out what's in your heart. I'm an old soldier, lad, an old soldier. I've learned to take the rough with the smooth. But I think I'll leave you now. Should like to be alone for a while. If you need me, you'll find me in the raspberry bushes." He'd scarcely gone when James also left the room. He took his hat and stick and walked blindly out of the garden. He knew not whither. His brain was numbed. Then, as his powers of reasoning returned, he told himself that he should have foreseen this ghastly thing. If there was one type of character over which Leela J. Pinkney had been wont to spread herself, it was the pathetic guardian who loves his ward but relinquishes her to the younger man. No wonder the girl had broken off the engagement. Any elderly guardian who was allowed himself to come within a mile of Honeysuckle College was simply asking for it. And then, as he turned to walk back, a sort of dull defiance gripped James. Why, he asked, should he be put upon in this manner? If the girl liked to throw over this man, why should he be the goat? He saw his way clearly now. He just wouldn't do it, that was all. And if they didn't like it, they could lump it. Full of a new fortitude, he strode in at the gate. A tall, soldierly figure emerged from the raspberry bushes and came to meet him. "Well," said Colonel Carteret. "Well," said James defiantly. "Am I to congratulate you?" James caught his keen blue eye and hesitated. It was not going to be as simple as he had supposed. "Well, into the keen blue eye there came a look that James had not seen there before. It was the stern, hard look, which probably had caused men to bestow on this old soldier the name of Cold Steel Carteret. You've not asked Joes to marry you? No, not yet. The keen blue eyes grew keener and bluer. Rodman, said Colonel Carteret in a strange, quiet voice. I've known that little girl since she was a tiny child. For years she has been all in all to me. Her father died in my arms, and with his last breath bade me see that no harm come to his darling. I've nursed her through mumps, measles, and chicken pox, and I'd live but for her happiness. He paused with a significance that made James's toes curl. Rodman, he said, do you know what I would do to any man who trifled with that little girl's affections? He reached in his hip pocket, and an ugly-looking revolver glittered in the sunlight. I would shoot him, like a dog. Like a dog, faltered James. Like a dog, said Colonel Carteret. He took James's arm and turned him towards the house. She is on the porch. Go to her. And if... He broke off. But tut, he said in a kinder tone. I'm doing you an injustice, my boy. I know it. Oh, you are, said James fervently. Your heart is in the right place. Oh, absolutely, said James. Then go out to her, my boy. Later on you may have something to tell me. You'll find me in the strawberry beds. It was very cool and fragrant on the porch. Overhead little breezes played and laughed among the roses. Somewhere in the distance sheep bells tinkled, and in the shrubbery a thrush was singing its evensong. Seated in her chair behind a wicker table laden with tea things, Rose Maynard watched James as he shambled up the path. Tea's ready, she called gaily. Where's Uncle Henry? A look of pity and distress flitted for a moment over her flower-like face. Oh, forgot, she whispered. He's in the strawberry beds, said James in a low voice. She nodded unhappily. Of course. Oh, why is life like this? James heard her whisper. He sat down. He looked at the girl. She was leaning back with closed eyes, and he thought he'd never seen such a little squirt in all his life. The idea of passing his remaining days in a society revolted him. He was stoutly opposed to the idea of marrying anyone, but if, as happens to the best of us, he ever were compelled to perform the wedding glide, he'd always hoped it would be with some lady golf champion who would help him with his putting, and thus, by bringing his handicap down a notch or two, enable him to save something from the wreck, so to speak. But to link his lot with a girl who read his aunt's books and liked them, a girl who could tolerate the presence of the dog Toto, a girl who clasped her hands in pretty, childish joy when she saw a nasturtium in bloom, it was too much. Nevertheless, he took her hands and began to speak. Miss Maynard. Rose. She opened her eyes and cast them down. A flush had come into her cheeks. The dog Toto at her side sat up and begged for cake disregarded. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time there was a lonely man who lived in a cottage all by himself. He stopped. Was it James Rodman who was talking this bilge? Yes, whispered the girl. But one day there came to him out of nowhere a little fairy princess. He stopped again, but this time not from the sheer shame of listening to his own voice. What caused him to interrupt his tale was the fact that at this moment the tea table suddenly began to rise slowly in the air, tilting as it did so a considerable quantity of hot tea onto the knees of his trousers. Cried James, leaping. The table continued to rise and then fell sideways, revealing the homely countenance of William, who, concealed by the cloth, had been taking a nap beneath it. He moved slowly forwards, his eyes on Toto. For many a long day, William had been desirous of putting to the test once and for all the problem of whether Toto was edible or not. Sometimes he thought yes, at other times no. Now seemed an admirable opportunity for a definite decision. He advanced on the object of his experiment, making a low whistling noise to his nostrils, not unlike a boiling kettle. And Toto, after one long look of incredulous horror, tucked his shapely tail between his legs, and turning, raced for safety. He had laid a course in a beeline for the open garden gate, and William, shaking a dish of marmalade off his head a little petulantly, galloped ponderously after him. Rose Maynard staggered to her feet. "Oh, save him!" she cried. Without a word, James added himself to the procession. His interest in Toto was but tepid. What he wanted was to get near enough to William to discuss with him the matter of the tea on his trousers. He reached the road and found that the order of the runners had not changed. For so small a dog, Toto was moving magnificently. A cloud of dust rose as he skidded round the corner. William followed. James followed William. And so they passed Farmer Burkett's farm. Farmer Giles's cowshed, the place where Father Wiggett's pigsty used to be before the big fire, and the Bunch of Grapes public house. Joe Biggs proper licensed to sell tobacco, wines and spirits. And it was as they were turning down the lane that leads past Farmer Robinson's chicken run that Toto, thinking swiftly, bolted abruptly into a small drain pipe. "William!" roared James, coming up at a canter. He stopped to pluck a branch from the hedge and swooped darkly on. William had been crouching before the pipe, making a noise like a bassoon into its interior, but now he rose and came beamingly to James. His eyes were aglow with chumminess and affection, and placing his forefeet on James's chest, he licked him 3 times on the face in rapid succession. As he did so, something seemed to snap in James. The scales seemed to fall from James's eyes, and for the first time he saw William as he really was, the authentic type of dog that saves his master from a frightful peril. A wave of emotion swept over him. "William," he muttered. "William." William was making an early supper of a half-brick he had found in the rod. James stooped and patted him fondly. "William," he whispered, "you knew when the time had come to change the conversation, didn't you, old boy?" He straightened himself. "Come, William," he said, "another 4 miles and we'll reach Meadow Sweet Junction. Make it snappy and we shall just catch the up express. First stop London." William looked up into his face, and it seemed to James that he gave a brief nod of comprehension and approval. James turned. Through the trees to the east he could see the red roof of Honeysuckle Cottage, lurking like some evil dragon in an ambush. Then together, man and dog passed silently into the sunset. "That," concluded Mr. Mulliner, "is the story of my distant cousin James Rodman. As to whether it's true, of course, that's an open question. I personally am of the opinion that it is. There is no doubt that James did go to live at Honeysuckle Cottage, and while there underwent some experience which has led an ineradicable mark upon him. His eyes today have that unmistakable look, which is to be seen only in the eyes of confirmed bachelors whose feet have been dragged to the very brink of the pit, and who have gazed at close range into the naked face of matrimony. And, if further proof be needed, there is William. He is now James's inseparable companion. Would any man be habitually seen in public with a dog like William, unless he had some solid cause to be grateful to him, unless they were linked together by some deep and imperishable memory? I think not. Myself, when I observe William coming along the street, I cross the road and look into a shop window till he's passed. I'm not a snob, but I dare not risk my position in society by being seen talking to that curious compound. Not that the precaution is an unnecessary one. There is about William a shameless absence of appreciation of class distinction, which recalls the worst excesses of the French Revolution. I've seen him with these eyes chivvy a Pomeranian belonging to a baroness in her own right from near the Achilles statue to within a few miles of the Marble Arch. And yet James walks daily with him in Piccadilly. Surely significant. And that's Honeysuckle Cottage by P.G. Wodehouse. A gentle way to end an evening of frightening stories. I hope you've enjoyed our little time together. I'm covered in bits of makeup and very thirsty, and I really need to go to the toilet. Thank you very much for joining me. This has been the end of my spooky game streams on urban planning. Have a happy Halloween, everybody. I hope you have a chilling rest of an evening. I'll be making more game videos over the next couple of months. There'll be more music stuff on the Urban Planning channel. There'll be stuff on Twitch, twitch.tv/urban_planning. Come and hang out, subscribe, say hi, whatever. Thank you very much for joining me. And I hope you all have a pleasant fright.